Thank you for joining us online here at Fam Church as we start our new series at the movies with the movie Unbroken. If you haven't already, please click the subscribe button below to subscribe to our YouTube channel and go out to Facebook at facebook.com/famchurch. And now our lead pastor, Brian Lane.
Welcome to Fam Church. Everybody's got their popcorn? That's good. Yeah, it smells amazing. I mean, wasn't it so good walking in the door this morning and having the scent of freshly popped popcorn hit you in the face? Yeah, well, as I said, welcome. It's good to have everyone here on this second Sunday in July. And if you're here for the first time, we are very excited that you are here with us today. And if you are just here kind of checking out the whole church thing and this whole Jesus thing, we are glad that you took a chance on us today. We're glad that you took a risk to be here in our church today. And so what better Sunday to be a first-time guest at our church than a week when we have popcorn, right? I mean, what could be better than having that? I mean, it seemed like there was energy here because everybody was excited about having popcorn. I don't know. And I love popcorn. And the reason we got popcorn is because we're starting this new movie series called this new series called At the Movies. But popcorn is something I just love. I love eating it. I just enjoy it. This last week, me and Aaron and Ashley, we went to the movies. We went and saw the movie Inside Out. And my favorite thing about going to the movies is getting the big thing of popcorn, the big tub of popcorn. Now, I have to tell you, when I walk up to the cash register and they tell me how much that big thing of popcorn is, it's not as exciting as it was when I first got it. But we ate it, and they give you one free refill when you buy a large, and so we got our free refill. We brought popcorn home with us. I thought that I'd be full after eating popcorn, then an hour later having dinner, but I wasn't. I was snacking on popcorn all night. I got up the next day, there was still popcorn left, and so guess what? I snacked on popcorn the next day too. So I love popcorn. But what we're going to be doing in this series is we're going to be looking at several movies. Now, we're not going to be watching the movie. That was the question I had this morning. Well, are we going to be watching the movie? No, we're not going to be watching the movie the movies we're going to be talking about. Well, we're going to look at their plot line. We're going to look at the plot, the point, the reason the movie was created, and then we're going to see where the movie and the Bible connect. Where there's things in the story, where there's concepts and ideas in the story of the movie that relate to things that God has communicated us and has an impact and speaks into our life as followers of Jesus. And so the movie that we're going to start with this morning is a movie called Unbroken. And it was a movie that came out in December of 2014. It was the directing debut for Angelina Jolie. And I know that some people weren't excited about her directing it, but I didn't care. But it's the story of a life of a guy named Louis Zamperini. And this is probably not a name that stands out to you. He was an Italian immigrant who grew up in California during his high school years. And while he was in high school, he started to get into trouble, and so his brother pushed him into running track, and he soon became an all-state athlete in the state of California in track. He was so good that when he turned 18, he actually made the U.S. Olympic team in the 5,000-meter run. And he actually competed in the 1936 Olympics in Berlin. And he finished 8th place in his race, not a great finish, but he set the world record for a single lap in the 5,000-meter run. And so because he had ran the last lap so fast in 56 seconds, Adolf Hitler was there watching the race, and Hitler wanted to meet him because of how fast he was. And he said when he walked up to Hitler, Hitler said, you're the young man with the very fast time around the track. And that was his connection with Hitler. And so he gets back from the Olympics, and so what does he do? Like any 18-year-old, he goes off to college and he enrolls at USC. Now, I know we're in SEC country, but this USC is not the University of South Carolina. Okay, this is the University of Southern California. And he enrolls there. He gets in the track program. In 1938, he set the NCAA record for the mile, a record that stood for 15 years. Well, World War II breaks out. And Louis enlisted in the United States Army Air Corps. And he served as a bombardier on a B-24 Liberator. Well, during a bombing run against one of the Japanese-held islands called Nauru in 1943, his bomber was badly damaged and it was no longer able to fly. So waiting for reassignment, waiting for him and his crew to get reassigned to a different plane, they said, hey, we need you guys to do something. There was a B-24 that was lost over the South Pacific. We need you to get into this airplane and see if you can find them. Go on a search. And so him and his crew, they just said, okay, we'll go do that. We'll go on this search. And so they board this B-24, and it was called the Green Hornet. Now, the Green Hornet was known as a plane that had mechanical problems. It was called a lemon by those who flew it. Well, about 850 miles south of Oahu, they had engine problems. And this plane went down in the middle of the South Pacific. On the flight, on the crash, 11 of the 13 did not survive. It was Louis, the pilot, and one other person who actually survived the crash. They got into this raft and they started to float around the South Pacific for many days. They had little food and no water, and so they subsisted on captured rainwater and small fish eaten raw. They caught 2 albatrosses, which they ate, and used pieces of the bird as bait to catch fish, all while fending off constant shark attacks and nearly being capsized by a storm. They were strafed multiple times by a Japanese bomber, putting holes in their raft. However, it did not sink, and it did not kill anyone on board. Well, on day 33, one of the 3 men that was in the ship, the raft, the pilot, he ends up dying, and so it's Louis and one other guy left. After 42 days, they arrive, they wash up on the Marshall Islands, and they were immediately captured by the Japanese Navy. They were held in captivity, severely beaten and mistreated until the end of the war in August 1945. Initially held at Kwajalein Atoll for 42 days, they were transferred to the Japanese prisoner of war camp Ofuna for captives who were not registered as prisoners of war. Zamperini was later transferred to Tokyo's Amori POW camp and was eventually transferred to the Naoetsu POW camp in northern Japan, where he stayed until the war ended. He was tormented much of that time by a prison guard named Mutsuhiro Bird Watanabe, who was later included in General Douglas MacArthur's list of the 40 most wanted war criminals in Japan. And that's the story that the movie tells us. The thing is that the movie cuts his story a little bit short, because the most important thing that happens in Louis Zamperini's story actually happens after the movie concludes. They put up some words to tell you what happens, but it can't be explained. After his camp was liberated in northern Japan and he was brought back to the United States in 1945, he got married. And he started, as soon as he got back, when he on his honeymoon and with his wife, he started having dreams of his tormentors that had been tormenting him in Japan in those prison camps those 2 years. And soon he started to drink more and more and more. He was trying to forget the things that had happened to him when he was in this prisoner of war camps. Well, his wife, in trying to find a solution to the problem, ends up going to a Billy Graham crusade in Los Angeles. At this crusade, Louis' wife gives her heart to Jesus and becomes a Christian. And then for years and years, Louis just kept being tormented by these dreams. For 4 long years, he went on being tormented by the thoughts of his captors and the torture that they had put on him. And finally, his wife convinced him, you know what? You need to come hear this dude, Billy Graham, speak with me. So in 1949, at the egging on of his friends and his wife, he finally went and heard Billy Graham preach. And as he was sitting there in this Billy Graham crusade, the words that Billy Graham was speaking just cut right to his heart. And he remembered the days that he was afloat on this boat and his days in the prison camps and the prayers that he had prayed to God. And at that moment, he knew that he was a sinner, that he was away from God, and he needed to give his life to Jesus. And so he gave his life to Jesus. After he did that, he said, you know what, I can't just stop there. I think in order to get these dreams to end, I need to forgive the guards who kept me prisoner. And so Louis forgave the guards who had held him prisoner. But not only did he forgive him, he got on a plane, went to Japan, found each and every single one of those men who were his tormentors, went to their doors, knocked on their doors and said, my name is Louis Zamperini. I was in your prison camp. You tortured me. You treated me horribly, but I want you to know that I forgive you. Several of the guards became believers. The only one who refused to meet with him was his chief and most brutal tormentor during the war, Mutsuhiro Watanabe. And so as you're listening to that story, I hope that the thought entered your mind. I mean, really, how could he do that? How could a man who had been tormented, who had been beaten, who had been just abused by somebody, how could he go to them and say that he forgives them for the horrible things that they had done to him? Instead, wouldn't he look at himself and say, you know what? I have a right to be angry. I have a right to not offer forgiveness. I have a right to be mad at what has happened to me. Because that's where we would be at, wouldn't we? When something happens to us, when people treat us wrong, when we're in life and things happen and we don't expect from people that we didn't think it would come from, we think to ourselves, you know what? I've got a right to be mad at them for what they did to me. Because we want to protect ourselves. We want to make sure that this thing never happens to us again. And so this is what we're going to dig into this morning. We're going to talk about forgiveness. And to look at this, we're going to look at a parable that Jesus told when the disciples questioned him on this whole idea of forgiveness. So if you could turn in your Bible to Matthew chapter 18, verses 21 through 35. That's where we're going to be today. If you do not have a Bible or you have no clue where Matthew 18 is in that, that's all right. We're going to put it on the screen so that you'll be able to see it and read along with us. And so this is what it says in Matthew chapter 18, starting in verse 21. Then Peter came to Jesus and asked, Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother or sister who sins against me? Up to 7 times? Jesus answered, I tell you, not 7 times, but 77 times, or 70 times 7. Therefore the kingdom of heaven is like a king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. As he began the settlement, a man who owed him 10,000 bags of gold was brought to him. Since he was not able to pay, the master ordered that he and his wife and his children and all that he had be sold to repay the debt. At this, the servant fell on his knees before him. Be patient with me, he begged, and I will pay back everything. The servant's master took pity on him, canceled the debt, and let him go. But when the servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 denarii. He grabbed him and began to choke him. Pay back what you owe me, he demanded. His fellow servant fell to his knees and begged him, be patient with me and I will pay you back. But he refused. Instead, he went off and had the man thrown into prison until he could pay the debt. When the other servants saw what had happened, they were outraged and went out and told their master everything that had happened. Then the master called in the servant. You wicked servant, he said, I canceled all that debt of yours because you begged me to. Shouldn't you have mercy on your fellow servant just as I had on you? In anger, his master handed him over to the jailers to be tortured until he should pay back all he owed. This is how my heavenly Father will treat each of you unless you forgive your brother or sister in your heart. All right, this is a parable, and this flows out of this question that Peter asked Jesus in verse 21, and it really flows out of something that Jesus said in verses 15 through 20 in chapter 18 of that same section. Jesus tells his disciples that they needed to forgive their brother when they did something against them, and so it caused the disciples to really start to think, okay? It really started to cause them to consider, what is Jesus saying here? Because in the religion of the time, what the story was is that you were able to forgive somebody up to 3 times for something they had done against you. Okay, so let's say somebody shows up at your house and first they steal some money from you. Then a little bit later they go out, they harvest some of your crops and they go and sell them and they take that money. Then they come and they try and steal your wife. And then after that they walk up and punch you in the face. Okay, so you got 4 offenses against you. According to the Jewish law at the time, it was okay for you to forgive them for 3 of those offenses. But once you got to the 4th offense, then you no longer had to forgive anymore. And so Peter and the disciples, in listening to Jesus tell this story, they were wondering to themselves, what is the answer to this question? How many times now do we have to forgive? Because Jesus is a little bit radical. Jesus is a little bit different than the Jewish leaders who were around at the time, than the religious leaders at the time. And so they really wanted to know, what did this mean? And so in starting in verse 22 there, or 21, Peter says, should I forgive him up to 7 times? See, Peter thought that he was being extra compassionate there when he said that. See, Peter thought, and actually he was being incredibly smart here. He'd been with Jesus long enough. He'd watched Jesus long enough in ministry to know that Jesus was really compassionate. And so when Peter asked this question, he was thinking to himself, I'm going to impress Jesus here. This is going to impress him. See, I'm going to ask him, we normally forgive 3 times, but I'm going to ask Jesus, hey, Jesus, should we forgive 7 times? I mean, that's 250% greater than what was offered, 2.5 times what the normal Jewish person would offer offering forgiveness. And so Peter was thinking to himself, I'm doing good here. 250%, that's always better, right? If you make 250% more money, that's good, right? If you have 250% more house, that's good. If you have 250% more car, all of this stuff is good. And so Peter thought, hey, I'm saying something good here. Jesus should recognize this. But poor Peter didn't get it right. It wasn't even close to what Jesus was thinking. Instead, Jesus tells him not even 7 times was good enough, but 70 times 7 times. That's 7,000% higher than Peter was going with his compassion. And then to illustrate the point, Jesus tells them this story. He tells them the story of a king who decides he's going to collect on all the debts that were owed him, and he brings in a man who owes him 10,000 talents. It says here 10,000 bags of gold. In the text I read, my Bible says 10,000 talents, and demands repayment. And back then there weren't collection laws, okay? There was no law that protected you from somebody coming and collecting a debt that you owed. If they showed up at your door, they knocked on your door and they said, hey, you owe me this amount of money and I need it now, you had to give it to them, or they had things that they could do against you in order to get that money from you. And so this king shows up and says, I need the money. And so there was 3 options in front of this man. The first option was he could take all of his property and sell it. The second option was, if that wasn't enough money selling all of his property, he could then take his property and sell it and sell himself as a slave to gain more money. Or then there was the third option. If that wasn't enough money, you could sell your property, you could sell yourself as a slave, then you could sell your wife and children as slaves as well, and hope that that would be enough to pay off the debt that you owe. And if that wouldn't cover it, they would use jail. And it appears that this man had already made himself a slave to the man that he'd borrowed money from. In verse 26, it says, at this, the servant fell on his knees. And I don't like going into like Greek words to make you think there's problems with the text of the Bible that we have. But that word there that they use as servant, that they translate as servant in the Bible, is this word called doulos. And this word doulos, almost every time it's translated from Greek into English, it's translated as slave, not servant. And so the assumption is here that this man had already sold himself to the man that he had borrowed the money from as a slave. And so he was basically working for this man for the rest of his life to pay off the debt that he owed the man. And obviously this wasn't happening fast enough for this king, for this man, because he came and he demanded the rest of the money. But here he is, he's a slave, he's working for the king. The king decides that the free labor he was getting was not enough to satisfy him. He wanted more of what he owed back, and he didn't want to have to wait for the man to work it off, so he decides that he's going to sell the man off. But not only was he going to sell the man off, he was going to sell his wife, his children, and all that he owed to pay the debt. What was the debt the man owed that involved selling off so much stuff? It says the man owed the king 10,000 talents. Now I know we're sitting there going, oh, that's not very impressive. Who cares? 10,000 talents. Well, let me break down some numbers for you. Okay, 1 talent. 1 talent was equal to 6,000 denarii. A denarii was a day's wage. Okay, so 1 talent was 6,000 days' wages. It would take the man working 16 and a half years just to pay off 1 talent. So if we do the math here of 6,000 days of work for 1 talent times 10,000 talents, we get 60 million days. He owed the man 60 million days of wages. Now here's the best part. If he were to work 50 years every day, not taking a day off, he would earn 18,250 days, which would equal 18,250 denarii. That falls considerably short of the number that he was trying to get to of 60 million days. See, there's no possible way this man could ever repay the debt that he had gotten into to this man. Now, what sane person would loan somebody this much money is kind of crazy. But that's where he was at. He owed the king that much. It would take him about 164,000 years to pay off his debt. It would be like us trying to pay off the national debt. Right now, the national debt is $18 trillion. I lost some time there because I remember when the last number I remember hearing is like 4 or 5 trillion. It's like 18 trillion. That's crazy, okay? I mean, that's crazy right there. But okay, you take the average household in Mulberry makes $57,000 a year. It would take 3 million years for an average household in Mulberry to pay off the national debt. It's never going to happen. It's the same thing with this case. It was never going to happen. So the man who owed a debt, not wanting him and his family and all that he owned sold off to repay it, goes to the king and he begs for more time. This king seems to be a nice guy. Not only does the king give him more time, but he just says, you know what? I'm going to have mercy on you. I'm just going to forgive everything. This king must have been loaded if he could forgive 60 million days' wages. But he just forgives it all. I mean, that's a lot of money. It would be awesome to be forgiven something like that, wouldn't it? I mean, it would just be incredible. My student loans feel like they're going to take 165,000 years to pay off. And I would like somebody to walk up and say, here, I'll take your student loans for you. I mean, they never go away. If you've got student loans, you know this, right? They never, Rob's back there, he knows. They never leave. They never go away. I feel like I owe the government until I die. But here's the thing. Through this forgiving act, this man avoids everything he owns being sold off, including his family. So I'm sure there was a lot of joy in the house because of that. I mean, could you imagine being told all your debts are forgiven? You're free? That would be an exciting day. I'd be jumping up and down. I'd be screaming for joy. I'd be so excited about that. And if this is where our story ended, if this is where Jesus' parable ended, it would be an incredible story. But it doesn't. See, the man who was forgiven a debt he could not pay back, he's walking down the street, having a good old time. I'm sure he was singing, he was shouting, he was dancing, he was lifting his hands. And all of a sudden, out of the corner of his eye, he catches this dude over here. Okay? And what does he see? He sees a guy who owes him 100 denarii. About 100 days' wages. Considerably easier to pay back than 10,000 talents. And you would think that the happiness that he was experiencing because of his debt being forgiven would have just made him pass that guy and say, oh, whatever. But no, what does he do? It says there that he stops. He turns to the guy, he grabs him by the throat, and he starts to choke him. I mean, think of the intense anger that was in this man's heart that he would just stop on the street and choke somebody. He demands repayment for the money that is owed. The man who owes him the money begs and asks for more time, but the man has no compassion on him. He takes him and throws him into prison until he can repay the money that is owed him. And this really doesn't make sense to me because in prison, is he going to be able to work to pay that back? No. So he's basically saying, I never want my money. I'm throwing you in jail. Makes no sense. I'd rather get my money. And so I'd rather have him out working, but he just throws him in jail. And so you may be saying, okay, how does this apply to us? Well, this is the first thing. This parable is really the story of every one of us in this room, whether we are a Christian or not. See, we all have a debt that we cannot pay. No matter how hard we try, no matter how much we work, no matter how good we are, we cannot pay that debt. And see, this is the first thing that gets many people in trouble, is because they think that they can somehow pay off this debt. They can pay off what is owed. But we can't. Our life is not long enough. There's not enough good works out there for us to be able to pay the debt off. The debt is the price owed for our sin, and the price is too high, and there's nothing we can do to pay it off. The only way out of the debt we owe is if the person who it was owed to forgave the debt. Who did we owe? God. And that's exactly what he did. When I was lost in sin, owing a debt I could not grasp, I could not understand, I could not get out of, I could not get free from, he came in and he canceled my debt and he set me free. Just like the man in the parable that we talked about. I've been completely set free from this debt that was hanging over my shoulders. See, this story is all of our story. This story is every one of our lives, whether you're a follower of Jesus or not. If you're a follower of Jesus, your debt has been forgiven. If you're not a follower of Jesus, your debt is still hanging over your shoulders, with God standing there saying, I can forgive that if you want me to. And just like the man who owed big in the story, because we've been forgiven, we should be able to forgive those who've done something to us. We should be able to offer the same thing we'd received in return to someone else. But a lot of people say, well, wait a minute, you don't understand what they did to me. No, I don't. But you know what? It really doesn't matter. It's not about what is owed to us. Nothing we are owed can match the debt that we owed to God. His Son came and died for us so that we could have forgiveness. That is something that we can never repay. It's something we can never make up for. The 100 talents that somebody else owes us, it's not really a big deal in the grand scheme of things. But there's more than that reason for us to offer forgiveness to somebody else because we've been forgiven. See, unforgiveness is something that can destroy someone, and God is trying to keep us from that. See, the man in the story who had been forgiven much, he allowed his unforgiveness to ultimately be his destruction. Think about it. He'd just been forgiven something that was about to cost him everything. You'd think there'd be happiness and excitement there. If it were me, like I said, I'd be skipping down the street out of pure joy of being forgiven. Our man here's walking down the street. He sees the guy out of the corner of his eye. He catches it and he says, I'm going to get him. I'm going to choke him out and I'm going to get my money from him. I mean, think of the anger that's built up there. Think of the pure, going from that pure joy to this pure anger in your heart because somebody owes you something. But see, that's what unforgiveness does to people. It sits there and it destroys them from the inside out. See, it can take the best situation and turn it into something bad. It can take a good memory and turn it into something we can hate. It can take a face, it can take a picture, it can take a mention of a name or event, and it can destroy any great moment. And see, God knows that this is what unforgiveness will do to our lives. So He tells us to forgive. But yet you say you still don't understand what they did to me. Well, what I do know is just like the two slaves in the story, the person you are holding unforgiveness against is just like you. They are bound in sin, unable to get free, carrying a debt they are not able to pay. What they owe us for our offense against us is insignificant to what we were forgiven. Corrie ten Boom, she was a Nazi concentration camp survivor. She was put there for hiding Jews from the Germans. And after she'd been liberated, after she'd been set free, after the war was over, she was speaking across Europe, telling people of her story, of what Jesus did in the concentration camps for her. And after she finished speaking, a man came up to her and said, I was one of your guards at Ravensbrück. I was one of the men who tortured you. But I've given my life to Jesus. Will you forgive me? She said, even as the angry, vengeful thoughts boiled through me, I saw the sin. Jesus Christ had died for this man. Was I going to ask for more? Lord Jesus, I pray, forgive me and help me to forgive him. She said, Jesus, I cannot forgive him. Give me your forgiveness. And she said, so I discovered that it is no longer our forgiveness anymore, that on our goodness, that the world's healing hinges, but on his. See, she knew that the anger she had for what he had done to her was insignificant. She knows that Jesus had died for this man to forgive a far more significant debt that was owed her. And because Jesus said to forgive him, she needed to forgive. See, she knew that if she did not forgive him, that she would end up like the man who was owed the 100 talents on the street. She knew that she would end up a cold, an angry, a bitter person, just waiting for something to happen so that she could let people know how angry she was. But she didn't let it. But really, when we refuse to forgive someone for what they've done to us, it's like telling the person, I'm going to sit here and think about you. I'm going to allow what you did to me fuel my anger and control my life. I'm not going to forget. I'm going to remember everything you've done. In other words, what you're saying is, I'm going to pour gasoline on myself, light myself on fire, and hope it hurts you. But it's never going to hurt the other person. You know, most of the time, the people that have done things against us have forgotten about the things that they've done. It's not even really a thought that crosses their mind. They generally don't feel guilty for the things that they have done. And so if you're waiting for someone to come to you and say, I forgive, or will you forgive me before you forgive them, it's probably not going to happen. And Jesus doesn't tell us to wait for someone else's forgiveness before we forgive them. Jesus tells us to forgive. To forgive. He says, stop lighting yourself on fire. Stop putting yourself through pain and through hurt and through torment for the things that they have done to you. And just forgive them. And let it go. And let it be free so that you don't have to live under that. And you know what? This principle, whether you're a follower of Jesus or not, is true for everyone. Even if you're not a follower of Jesus, you're sitting there, how does this work for me? If you forgive people who've done stuff to you, it's going to set you free from the hold that memory, that the things that person has done to you has on your life. If someone has hurt you in your past, if someone has done something to you, and every time their name is mentioned, you get mad, every time you see their face, you want to hit them, you find yourself wanting to choke them like Louis Zamperini, the only way you're going to be free is to forgive them. Now, is forgiveness something that you just pray a prayer for and say, I forgive them, and everything will go away and everything's going to be fine? No. Many times it has to be a constant choice in our life to forgive. It has to be something that we choose to do. Man, there are things that have happened in my past that if I were to think of them now and the people involved in those situations, they'll get me really mad. I mean, I was preparing Wednesday night's message. And I talked about the people who had slandered my name and said some horrible things about me in another church I was at, and you know, just sitting in my office thinking about the things that they said and the things that were done made me mad. I was ready to go find one of them and punch one of them in the face. I mean, okay, I say that phrase a lot. My wife lets me know I say that phrase a lot, but you're going to hear punch them in the face a lot, all right? And I was just mad. You know, it makes me mad. And it makes me think I'm justified in doing something against him. But every time that comes up in me, every time this thing wells up in me, I have to stop. And I have to say to myself, you know what? Jesus has forgiven me. He paid a much higher price. He bought me at a much greater debt. This debt that is owed me is not that great, and so it doesn't matter. I need to stop and forgive. And when we do that, that weight gets lifted off of us for the things that have been done to us. Because I've been forgiven far more than I can ever repay, far worse than what they have done to me, so I make the choice to forgive. Whenever those feelings come up, I make the choice to forgive. And so, Rob, if you could come on up. And this morning, maybe there's some of you that need to make a choice in your life to forgive those who have done something to you, to forgive those who owe you a debt. It's a debt they're never going to be able to pay back. It's a debt they're never going to be able to satisfy the desire in our heart for redemption. See, if Louis Zamperini was able to forgive Japanese soldiers who relentlessly tormented him for 2 years, why can we not forgive those who've done things to us? Corrie ten Boom, able to forgive a Nazi guard who under her hand she watched half of her family die. Forgive. See, they realized the fact that the people who had done this to them were just like them, desperately in debt and unable to pay that debt back. And so where are you this morning? Is there something that you could think about right now, would pop into the top of your head, something that's happened to you that you are just saying to yourself, I could never forgive them for that? Well, the challenge this morning is to let that go, to release that to God, to say, God, you know what? I'm going to choose to forgive them for their offenses against me. I'm going to choose to forgive them for what they've done to me because, God, I'm sick and tired of lighting myself on fire and hoping that they're going to suffer for the things that they did to me. Because when we do that, when we release that, the anger, the hurt, the pain, all of that stuff, God takes. And so the challenge this morning is for us to forgive. And I just want to take a moment, if everybody could just bow their heads and close their eyes. I just want to take a moment of reflection. I just want you to think about your life. Are there people? Are there things that have happened to you that you would say, I haven't forgiven that? And you need to release that and say, you know what? I'm going to choose to forgive today. If that's you, just quietly where you're sitting, just offer that prayer up to God. I mean, we don't need to know. I don't need to know. We're not going to ask anyone to raise their hands. But if that's you, if you've got some sort of unforgiveness that you're holding in your heart, just lift that up to God this morning and say, God, I want to choose to forgive in this situation. God, I want to choose to see your forgiveness in my life. I want to forgive them for what they've done to me.
I hope you enjoyed that message from our lead pastor, Brian Lane. If you did, please click the like button below to let us know. And if you would like any more information about Fam Church, please go out to myfamchurch.com and you'll find all of our information there. And thank you so much for joining us today at Fam Church Online.